I think we can get started. So thank you everybody again for joining us here today. Today's webinar is about Google Tag Gateway, which I'm sure many of you have heard a lot about, server-side Google Tag Manager, or both. So what we're here to talk to you about today is how to get the most out of your tagging stack, and there may be some questions that you're asking yourself or the business is asking you on what should we do. So I'm very lucky to be joined by Dan Truman here today as well. So Dan will do an intro in a moment, but what I'm really excited to discuss with Dan today is some of the questions that he hears from his clients that he's working with. So I'll hand over to you, Dan, to do an intro first, and then I'll go after you.
Sure. Hi, everyone. As James said, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are in the world. I'm Dan. I started Duga Digital about 5 years ago. I'll talk to you more about what we do and how we help different clients in a minute, but looking forward to this session. There's a lot of questions we get around all of these topics, so interesting to go through and hopefully help answer some of the ones that you might have outstanding in your minds.
Cool. Thanks, Dan. So thank you for taking the time to join us on this very, very warm day as it is out there. So yeah, so for those of you that don't know me, my name is James. I'm the head of sales here at Addingwell, based in London. I work with all of our clients and partners to help them get the most out of the platform that we provide. So just before we jump into the main topics of today, let's give you a bit of an overview of what we'll cover. So the first part will look at what is the objective and introduction and an introduction of Google Tag Gateway and understanding what it's all about, the options that are available to you, and then our expert that we have on the call, who Dan's just touched upon, the different questions that are often faced and considerations for organizations, and what decision would you take. So just as a introduction to the Didomi ecosystem and who we are. So the webinar today is organized by Didomi. Didomi is a privacy consent management platform. Within the group, there are several brands. So there is Didomi, Addingwell, which is the server-side tagging platform, and SourcePoint, which is another consent management platform. The organization has been around since 2017, servicing over 3,000 clients worldwide. We're on a mission to enable brands to get the best quality first-party consented data, and then be able to pipe that to the various partners that they work with to maximize the potential around activation. I'll hand over to Dan to tell you a little bit more about what Duga do.
Sure. So we're an agency, a consultancy within digital analytics and consent, and we have around 50 clients at any one time. Over the past 5 years, we've worked with probably 250 clients, partnered with Google, partnered with Addingwell and Didomi, and we have a number of technology partners and agency partners that we work with on a daily and weekly basis to help deliver best practice back to clients. We only look at digital data. We don't do any services around paid search, paid social, SEO, AI, or anything else like that now. And ultimately, we think we get the best results for our clients because we have that single laser focus on just digital data and the way that is working. It's a lot more technical now than it was in the past, and we're going to go through some of that today. And a lot of clients need help with that, and that's where we fit neatly into the market.
So we have the pleasure of partnering very closely with the Duga Digital team. They're one of our key strategic partners that we work with across both Didomi and Addingwell in the UK. So there's no challenge too big for you guys, as my experience and from what I see.
Not yet.
Not yet. Not yet. Not yet. Okay, so just as a reminder, if you have any questions as we're going through this, feel free to ask away in the chat. What we'll do to begin is, before we jump into the Google Tag Gateway topic, we'll talk about why we're here and generally what we're seeing in the market at the moment. So we always start with this overview, and Dan, feel free to jump in if you have anything to add on this. But right now, and over time, what we've started to see, and brands that we work with are starting to see the number of signals that they're able to capture from their website to start to decline. So most of you will know about consent and cookie banners, and the requirement for having the correct consent before you can start to track anybody that visits your website. There are additional factors to that around consent mode v2, and from a recent talk that I saw Dan do at an event, a lot of times setups often struggle when it comes to having the correct configuration with consent. But once you've got all that tidied up, there are other issues that prevent you from being able to track and see how your users are interacting with your audience. And that comes down to things like ad blockers, which prevent your tracking and any associated scripts and pixels from running. There are various browser-based restrictions out there that exist. So one of the most commonly known ones is Safari ITP, where the cookie is limited to a certain lifespan, and that can vary between 24 hours to 7 days. Similar restrictions exist on other browsers as well, with Firefox ETP and Brave having its own tracking restrictions. And then at some point in future, the third-party cookie that still exists, but for who knows how long with Chrome, will disappear. So what we typically see when we're working with brands is that over time, gradually, when they're looking at their analytics, that the amount of users that they're able to capture events, sessions, signals for has started to decline, and that then therefore has a knock-on impact to their attribution and the data quality and the signals that they can then send on to their partners.
Yeah, I mean, typically from that left-hand side of the graph to the right-hand side of the graph, you could be anywhere between 40 or 60% down from your 100% of your web traffic that you're expecting. And the difficulty there is that a lot of those pieces are unknown. There's not necessarily the ability to look, to see, and transparency to see what's actually happening. For example, Google have quoted for a couple of years now that ad blockers make up around 16 to 18% of lost data that's not recovered. The big unknown for me, I think at the moment, is Chrome. What they're going to do, what the next stage is. They could become the next Brave. That's one option they have. I don't think they will do that because Brave doesn't have an advertising platform that relies on data the same way Google does. But I think there's a lot of open questions there as to what happens next. So yeah, that's the story today. But as we've seen with lots of things in the last 6 months, there's always things around the corner that we don't know.
So we can have a look now at really what's causing that, and then what the move to the new world is before we jump into the gateway topic of today. So some of you may have seen on the left or be familiar with the left, but just to set the scene here, traditionally how client-side tagging has worked is each of the partners that you work with, so any tag that you deploy in your web container on GTM, on Google Tag Manager, loads a script directly on your website. So for example, if you're advertising with Google, Meta, TikTok, etc., there will be a pixel or a cookie or both landed on your website. There are a bunch of problems with that we just talked about in the previous slide. So that is what we just talked about in the slide before is the reason for the decline in the amount of users that you can track. It's not there's just one problem. There are a number of factors that impact how you can track and collect data from your website. So what the world is kind of moving towards, and really it's kind of, if you haven't done it by now, it's something that you should really be considering, is moving towards server-side tagging, which is what you see on the right-hand side. And the way that works is you still have one tag on the website to do the initial data collection, but rather than have all of the different partners that you're working with have their own script deployed directly on your own website, what you do is you have the server which then dispatches the events to each of the partners that you're working with. So rather than send one to each partner directly from your website, you send one to the server, and then that then dispatches you the event to each of the different partners that you're working with. The benefit that you get with that is control. Right now, if you're doing the left-hand side only, you don't really know what is leaving your website and where is it going, and you can't intercept that. Whereas when you move to server-side tagging, you take that dependency off what's happening on the website to some extent. So you can improve the website performance, but you can then start to actually enrich data in a server. So if you've got a scenario where you'd like to add offline conversion data as an example, or you want to implement the margin, so that can be sent to your ad platforms that you're working with, that effectively gives you that higher level of control to do more. But as well as that, moving to a server also then gives you the option to move to first party, which we'll talk about a little bit more today. So to kind of take a step back before we go into the detail, there are two popular options that we typically see that brands have to make a choice on. Now, one is the gateway approach. So as this is about Google Tag Gateway, it would be unfair not to talk about the other gateways that exist. So each of the ad platforms have their own. They all work independently of one another. So you end up in a world where each gateway, each partner ad platform that you work with, you have to have each one of those deployed onto your website. You would probably guess, as Addingwell, and we've talked about server side today, will advocate heavily for the right hand side, which is server side Google Tag Manager. And that's really because of one fundamental reason, to be honest. And it comes down to the point of it's better to have one place where you send the data to and you dispatch one, rather than having to maintain individual gateways. And this is what I was talking to Dan about earlier today, is that you always want control, but also you need to make sure you're scalable. And I'm sure you've seen the same, Dan, when you've been speaking to brands as well.
Yeah, I mean, the idea around those gateways is each ad platform is trying to operate and create new avenues for their own data collection. But that's from a vendor perspective. From a client or customer or brand perspective, often you're working with multiple platforms and you want to work on collecting data in the most efficient and best possible way, and to get the most out of it. And the ability to own that in one space means that ultimately server side is often the choice for a lot of enterprises and for a lot of brands who have got larger budgets or multiple levers that they're trying to pull. And it makes it a little bit more efficient and also a little bit more trustworthy in terms of comparison as well. If it's all being collected in the same methodology, you end up in a situation where you can have a bit of a like for like, apples and apples review and analysis. If you're looking at those gateways, they might be slightly different in the way that they're bringing that data back in.
Yeah, and we know one of the challenges that often is heard about when you're speaking to maybe a performance marketeer is, well, which dashboard do I trust? Who's correctly like counting that conversion?
Yeah, exactly. So the idea of having one place that counts in the same way, regardless of which ad platform it is helpful.
So just to show you what that looks like in practice, it's a very simplified schematic just to show you. But so that tab on the left, which was on the previous slide, which was about the gateways. So how it works is there is the script that loads on your website, the ad platform gateway that sits in the middle. So whether that's Google Tag Gateway, Meta, TikTok, etc. And then you have the vendor. So just remember that this is just one gateway here. If you were to work with 5 different vendors and you wanted to go down the gateway route, then you would need 5 instances of this, which, as you can guess from what we've just explained, we wouldn't recommend. On the other hand, the reason why we wouldn't recommend that is because of this structure. So when you're using server-side Google Tag Manager, again, you send the event data from your website to a single source, which is the server that sits in the middle. And then you then dispatched the same event to each of the different partners that you're working with. So you have an equal share of what everybody's receiving the same data at the end of it. And this doesn't just apply. So we talked about gateways because gateways often come from the advertising platforms. But what you have to remember as well is most organizations don't just work with ad platforms. There are analytics tools being used, most likely have a data warehouse or a CDP, and then there's the CRM as well. So what the server-side Google Tag Manager instances allow you to do is actually send data to all of those different platforms and tech partners that you're working with.
Yeah, I think just back on that slide, James, one of the interesting pieces here is not the technical changeover, it's more of the mindset for a lot of teams and the change management. Because as an example, and I'm not just picking on them, but Meta have a fairly generous generous view of their contribution within any look back windows for various purchases. Often that's some of the feedback I get from media agencies. And if you start sending the same number of purchase conversion events to Google Analytics, to ads, to Meta, and they all start lining up, a lot of people who've been working in this space for 15, 20 years or 10, 15 years, whatever it might be, they don't know how to necessarily optimize with that being true. So yeah, that's one thing to look out for, is that data does change shape, and the people around you will start asking questions of, what is this data doing? How does it get to this? Well, how do I work with this? Can I trust it? Lots of questions like that come out. So there is a change management angle in the background as well.
And I think that there's a question that's come from Lily, which actually might be a good time to answer this before we jump on to the next section. And I think this is one for you, Dan, because you spend a lot of time doing client-side to server-side implementations. So the question is, can you explain how heavy is the switch from browser to server-side tagging? How burdensome are the required changes for our digital teams?
Sure. So this is a question, as you can imagine, Lily, that we get quite a lot, because there is a bit of fear, because the word server strikes fear into lots of people who aren't necessarily technically minded. I'll be honest, before server-side tagging, it probably would have done the same to me. The answer is twofold. One, it depends on how deep you want to go into server-side tagging. So if you wanted to just have a comparison between your client side or browser side page views, as an example, and a server side page view setup, so that you could understand what uplift you were seeing or what gap you might be filling, that's quite straightforward to do. If you want to do a full scale mirroring or migration, that's a lot more that can be a lot more cumbersome, because you're going to have to duplicate tags, you're going to have to set up all of the infrastructure again in a server-side container where you've got it in the client-side container today. We have actually automated that process with something we call auto sGTM, which is a product that we built internally because we were getting a lot of requests to do exactly this work. And so we automated that process. Now it takes us about 2 minutes. But that's the sort of the breadth, if you like, from minimum amount of time to maximum amount of time. So yeah, a horrible consultancy answer of it depends.
Of course, it's only as big as the challenge itself. So
yeah,
but yeah, it also depends on so Dan and the team obviously work on a lot of implementation side. What the Addingwell side does is make the deployment of the infrastructure easy, and means that technical teams don't necessarily have to rely on it. So we often see between us that there is quite generally a quick turnaround, but that quick depends on how much needs to move. But it's not usually a month-to-month project. I would say it's weeks. I don't know if you agree with that, Dan.
Yeah, I think it's a case of, if you've got the checklist of things that you need to know and need to have decided done, then it can be quite quick. So the idea of, okay, we want to go server side. What kind of depth do we want to go server side in? Do we want to just dip our toe and understand that? Or are we looking to roll this out across multiple different brands and things like that? So the kind of sizing of the project, that's kind of number one. The second, as you just mentioned, James, is where are we hosting this? Are we hosting this with a third party like Addingwell? Are we hosting it on our own GCP? Are we putting Addingwell on top of that GCP? Lots and lots of questions there. The next step is which tags do we want to migrate and move across to server side? What gives us the best return? Obviously, you have to impact then the last part, which is around cost. But we'll go into this separately later. But there's a few stages, if you like, to think about before I can say how burdensome that might be.
We'll come on to that a little bit later. I think we'll save that for the questions for you a little bit later on. But so let's get into the topic of today. Let's talk about what is the objective of Google Tag Gateway. So from our perspective, there is a lot of confusion around the approaches and what it actually means to deploy Google Tag Gateway. So what we thought we'd do is, so actually there's a typo on this slide. It's 3 things because we had an idea just beforehand to add to this. So what it's all about is, number one, is moving your client-side setup to a first-party context using same origin. And the objective of that is to show that your tracking appears from your first-party domain. We'll come on in a moment to what same origin actually is to explain that with an example so you can see that. The second one is with Google Tag Gateway, what Google is aiming to do is to serve the Google tags through their own, so through your own domain, instead of loading them directly from the Google servers. So what that means effectively right now is that if you're doing client-side only, when you're loading Google Analytics or Google Ads, then what will happen is the request that is launched or the script on the page will be actually calling the Google domain rather than appearing to be from your own. And then ultimately, number 3, the last one, it's to improve signal quality and quantity. So what that in essence allows you to do is have more accurate reporting, and often what happens is conversion data is lost. And that's because those restrictions that we spoke about with the bar chart earlier on, they effectively prevent the tracking from working. So these are the 3 kind of key pillars that we see as what Google Tag Gateway is looking to achieve. And to be honest, this is what a lot of clients approach us really with their objective of how do we get better first party quality data from our website. So we put at the bottom the question from this, what you must ask yourself is what's the best approach for my business? So hopefully over the next couple of slides, you will be able to get a bit of a feel of what's the right direction to go in. So what we thought we would do is start with what is same origin and how does that work? So what happens is when a user goes to your website, the tracking is loaded in the browser. As I just mentioned, when it's loaded client-side in a client-side only world, it's loading googletagmanager.com. It's calling third-party domains, so outside of what your website is. What a same origin approach does is it introduces something called a reverse path. And that reverse path is, as an example, it's a little bit tiny on the screen. So underneath you'll see mydomain.com/ and then what looks like a folder structure. That is effectively the CDN of your website, which is placing all of the tracking scripts and requests behind your own domain. So it appears as if everything is coming from your website, not coming from a third party. What that then does is allows you to then point to either a gateway, so what we've just talked about with Google, Meta, etc., or a server, the second pillar, the server-side container that we spoke about as well. So fundamentally, what this does is allows everything to appear in a first-party way from your website. Now, we often recommend, and we still recommend, to be honest, you can also use a subdomain for your tracking. But what we have started to see over the course of time is that if you're using a subdomain like metrics.mydomain.com or sgtm.mydomain.com, there are some ad blockers and browsers that will actually detect that as a tracking URL, a tracking script, and prevent that from working. So we still do recommend using a subdomain, but a randomized name, not something that is associated to analytics or tracking. But what we are seeing as a kind of a shift in the market is the move towards the same origin approach. And that's what these gateways are also recommending as well. So what are the options? What we're going to talk through now is there are 3 options available that you can do with alongside Addingwell. So today, we're not going to talk about just doing G2G. We'll talk about G2G when you're using server-side GTM and the different approaches, and then also what happens if you just do a standard Addingwell deployment with that same origin approach. So for option A, what that is let's say you're already using like Addingwell today. It's to run G2G completely separately alongside your Addingwell setup. Option B is what we call a single path. So going to what we just described before, but routing the request for Google for the Google Tag Gateway element, and then the rest to your other partners that you work with, like Meta, TikTok, etc. And then the third one is using server-side Google Tag Manager with Addingwell in a same origin approach to route all of your requests to the partners that you work with, be it Google, Meta, TikTok, Pinterest, etc. But then also bypassing the various restrictions we spoke about in the slide earlier on, such as ad blockers, Safari, ITP, etc. So we'll start with option A, just to explain a simple schematic in terms of how this works. Just as a note, we will share the slides after today. So if there are any questions, feel free to ask them again as we go. But the slides will be shared. We do have documentation on this as well. So for option A, how to run Google Tag Gateway in parallel to Addingwell. So the way that it works is the user visits your website. So this is the client-side tracking. Then what happens for the Google Tag Gateway element is you load Google Tag Gateway and the Google scripts. And then what happens is for any requests related to Google, they will still be handed through this flow. So they will go via the CDN and Google Tag Gateway. But for any of your other scripts or partners that you're working with, so Meta, TikTok, etc., what will happen is Addingwell will exist as the server-side Google Tag Manager engine, which then you can then collect and forward the events to all of the tags that you have configured in your server container. So the way that this works is, and what we kind of see from this approach, and we'll do this comparison for all of those 3 options so you can see a high level. So what this does allow you to do is move to that first party way of loading scripts from Google tags from your domain. What we do see is that this approach doesn't overcome the ad blocker issues that prevent the tracking and the script from running. And we do see for the Google tags as well that the analytics and ads will be impacted by the Safari ITP restriction that we spoke about earlier on. The other tags that you have configured will work through the server container, but with Addingwell, but directly with Google Tag Gateway will not pass through there, so they won't see the uplift through that piece. And then you don't have any control or ability to enrich the data there. So this is a lower medium setup. There is some configuration that needs to be done. So let's jump onto the option B. So this is using the same origin approach that we spoke about a few slides ago. So it's a similar workflow. What happens is, so you have the tag on the website. And then what you do is the reverse path, the same origin reverse path that we spoke about, which is either example.com or mydomain.com/ then a random string, that folder name that then forwards to the CDN. What happens after this point is you then split where the events go. So what you have is two options. On the left-hand side, you'll see that we have the Google destination, which is sending the request to Google, so to Google Analytics, to Google Ads. And then on the right-hand side, you still have the server behind the CDN, which is sending the events then to the other platforms that you have configured in the server container in Google Tag Manager. So we have the same table that follows this, but we see different results and what happens. So yes, you are loading from a first-party context, which is good from a tracking perspective. We do see with this route that there are issues with how you can bypass ad blockers. So it's the same as option A. There is a limit in terms of how many ad blockers you can get around, and any browser-based restrictions as well. With Safari ITP, that does potentially work, but it requires some configuration in the CDN, which does create a potential point of failure as a possible risk. So it needs to be monitored. But what you will see is you will see the same data being passed through to your other partners that you're working with as well, because of the server involvement there for Google, and the other tags you can start to enrich. And then there is some monitoring alerting available as well. And we classify this as a medium level of complexity because there is configuration that needs to be done with the CDN as well. And the final option that we'll talk about is routing everything just directly through the Addingwell platform with the same origin approach. So again, very similar schematic diagram. You have your same origin reverse path that points to the server side setup, which is with Addingwell. And what happens is, rather than having to split and route the request to different destinations, what you do is you allow the server container to take care of all of that. And in doing so, it simplifies what you need to manage and to set up. But also those restrictions that we spoke about earlier on with the ad blocker bypass, and how the Google files are delivered to the GTM.js and where the G tag is delivered to the website. Because of the ad blocker bypass now being able to function correctly, it means you actually close the gap on how much data you weren't able to track. And what that looks like when you move to this route is that everything does appear. So all of your scripts are loaded from your own domain. The ad blocker and browser restriction is maintained, and you can make sure that everything is loaded. Similar with Safari, once you configure and set up the CDN, that will then allow the cookie to be maintained for a longer lifespan, for up to 13 months. And then with the other points below, so all of your partners, not just your Google tags, are receiving all of the uplifted data. If you have any more advanced use cases where you want to, going back to the diagram earlier where we talked about sending margin data, or you want to send offline conversion data, you're able to do that as well. You have the full control of being able to filter or strip like PII, or you can enrich if you wish as well. And then because all of the events and all of the data is passing through the server container, what it gives you is full visibility on every request being sent through, so you can actually monitor that it's working correctly. So you go from having a partial view, or maybe not a view, to actually a safety net in terms of what you can actually see passing through the platform. So I won't go through this in great detail, but we'll share this as part of the slides just to give you the comparison between each of the options that we've just talked through. Before I move on, I see there's a question from Julian, so we'll take that before we move on. So that question is from a governance standpoint, does moving from a third party to a first party bring new responsibilities for a website editor or owner? Would you like to take that one, Dan, or do you want me to take it?
I will answer partially, and then maybe you can take the rest of it, James. But from a technical perspective, we're not actually changing too much, really. You're going to have to update your privacy and cookie policies to let your users know how you are interacting with their data and what you're doing with it. Depending on where you are in the world, Julian, and judging by some spelling, maybe France, maybe French Canada, or somewhere else speaking French, it's not. It depends on the local restrictions. We're not saying you can do this without consent. That's the other thing we should make very clear across all of this. Everything is consent based. You need to receive consent before you can do the tracking, depending on which territory you're in. And the other side of this, the third part of that is we're still using third parties. We're just changing the way that that tracking is implemented. So it's less about changing responsibilities. You still have the same engagement, if you like, or the same relationship with Google or any other platform. That's just how it's just a different way of implementing it. I don't know if you want to enrich that, James.
Yeah, so I agree completely with Dan. I think the other layer to add to that is when you typically move from client side tracking to server side, what you add in the middle is an element of control. So with third party, you actually don't see what's being sent to the partner that you're working with, whereas with the server in between, bringing that into the first party way of working. So with option C, I'm talking about in this example, what you end up with is actually the ability to strip data. So if you're working with a partner, big advertising platform potentially that you want to remove PII from so that it isn't sent, that is a valid use case that moving to first party and server side does allow you to do. It gives you that full governance and control over what data is being sent where. What it also allows you to do is also check, are you sending the correct consent signals to that platform as well? So the last thing you want to do is, one of your users declines, but you still send data to a partner. Having that server and having that visibility gives you that extra level of control and visibility so that if that does happen, you can see it. So yeah, if anything, there is always a misconception that often comes up that server side is like about a black box and you can't see what's going on. But actually, if done correctly, you actually gain greater control, not just for you as a brand, but also for your visitors and your audience as well.
Yeah, I think we're about to go on to talking about that kind of sort of alerts and insights. But we've talked about this a number of times on one of our implementations, or a couple of our implementations. API tokens are often the things that expire. So Meta, you have to have an API in order to make sure that the data from your ad set is going into the right places, back into reporting, or you're able to send it via the API. And they expire after a certain duration. And so that stops the tracking in process. Now, if that was a client-side pixel, the only way you would find that out is by a drop in your campaign performance numbers over the next day or weeks, depending on your cadence of reporting. If you just set it and leave it, then it might break and you wouldn't know. If the trigger fails or if the criteria stop being met, you wouldn't have a clue. Whereas because we're going via server, we can actually start to see, as James said, what's going in, what's coming out, and actually, if it fails automatically, our record now is, I say record, it's not a wanted record, but our record for fixing that broken tracking is 12 minutes. From when we get an alert to reconfiguration, 12 minutes, rather than days or weeks or whatever it might be, we can be on the front foot and make sure that our clients are not still paying for their campaigns and they are getting the data back that they want and need.
Yeah, and that looks a little bit like this. So we call it I call it anyway, the safety net, because what we typically see is, like adding to what Dan has just said, if you don't really know what's happening, you are blind to whether everything is working correctly. So what we do is, so whether you're coming at this from a privacy standpoint or a marketeer standpoint for performance, for me, they both plug together very, very well in terms of, for a marketer to be able to have the best quality targeting, they need high quality first party consented data. But the privacy compliance side of things need to make sure that actually that data is being tracked, is being used and sent in the correct way. And that's what we effectively do on the Addingwell side, is make sure that we call it a black box for the server, to make sure that you can basically take the lid off and have a look inside. And then if something doesn't go wrong, you can challenge Dan's record to fix time, in terms of making sure that any issues that have arisen are solved as quickly as possible, because there could be a legal compliance issue with sending the wrong consent signal. There could be a marketing budget wastage element to it. So these are things that affect not just one part of the business, but various different teams. And it all comes down to one very simple thing at the top of the funnel, which is collecting the right consent and then making sure that your tracking is working correctly. So what we'll do next is, we'll have a little bit of a discussion with Dan. If you guys have any questions, there are no limits. Sorry, Dan. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask those in the chat. But what we thought we'd do is, because Dan and his team are at the coalface day in, day out doing these implementations and getting a lot of questions from brands who are looking at, should we do Google Tag Gateway? Should we do server-side GTM? How we should go forward. So how should we go forward? Sorry. So let's start with the first question for you then, Dan. So so we were talking earlier about a recent discussion that you've had. So what's the kind of main three questions that you're seeing coming from brands at the moment when it comes to the topics that we talked about today?
I think main three questions are probably around, is it for us? Who should be doing this, and why and when, and what the benefits are and how they can sell them back in. And then, are there any ongoing costs or maintenance or anything that needs to come alongside that? So you end up in a situation where there's a question of, what's the thing we're trying to do? How should we do it? And how is this a one-time thing? Is ultimately, I guess, where clients and brands are looking at this.
So to add to that then, so let's go one step further, maybe relating to the first question that we had today. So if you right now have a client-side container only, yep, do you have to make changes for Google Tag Gateway? What do you need to do?
You don't. In both of the scenarios that I would, all the scenarios we talked about today, I would highly recommend cleaning out old tags, doing a full sweep of the container as is today. So if you haven't gone server side yet, and if you haven't put this via Google Tag Gateway, I would still recommend cleaning out everything and making sure that you're in tip-top shape. But there isn't anything on the Google Tag Gateway side, that option on the standalone, that you need to do. You can serve that via the CDN on its own, and you won't have to do anything different on the day-to-day. You can still service the Google Tag Manager container exactly as you would today. No need to go into a different platform. No need to manage another serving container, just as is.
And just to lead on from that then, so if you have a server-side setup, do you have to manage two containers? How does it work?
You do have to manage two containers, but it's very limited in management of one. It's very much weighted in favor of the server side. So the configuration set there, if you are working with a third party, you will have a client-side container, a server-side container, and then a third-party hosting platform that will ultimately give you data on what's happening from the server container, which is very useful. And as James showed on the screenshot before, there is data there that you can't necessarily see for a client-side container because you're going via that server. If you are working through a cloud platform setup, you have that similar level of data working there, but it's not in any great detail and it's not in a nice UI. You have to query it yourself. You have to be confident with what you're doing within the cloud platform. So that's the slight difference, is that there is more maintenance on the server side, but there is also more gain and benefit and potentially more data and more control. So you have more maintenance, but you also have more opportunity. So that's kind of the way I would look at that.
So to follow on to that, maybe more of a question around, okay, that sounds good. More data, more control. Mm-hmm. What's involved when it comes to change? Like, what does that look like? What's the kind of journey you see a lot of brands go on? What journey do you have to go on with those brands to make sure that they get the most out of this exercise?
Yeah. So there is a real benefit here because those options and methods are very different. We can run them in parallel. So we have the ability to run only a browser side or client side container and all of the tags in there. And then on the other side, we can create a server only container and then create a dashboard, which ultimately puts the two side by side so that we can have that comparison. And whilst there are, and we'll probably go into this in a second, whilst there are ongoing costs for the server side, you can make the business case quite quickly if there is an increase in conversions, if there is an increase in data, if there is an increase in the control and ability to do whatever you want with the data. For example, if you start putting in margin back into bidding algorithms, you could improve your conversion efficiencies within the different ad platforms, and that in itself might create a business case that outweighs the cost for the hosting of server side. So that's kind of where I see the opportunities and the ways in which this works quite well for our clients. Is initial stage is run them both in parallel, understand what's working, what the numbers mean, get used to it, and that transition, that change management piece that I mentioned before, gives people confidence that they can trust what's happening now rather than longing or pining for their old numbers.
So it would be wrong not to talk about the cost involved, given everything we've talked about today. When you introduce an infrastructure, it does have a cost. So for all of the options we've talked about today, there are costs associated. So for GTG, from your experience, have you seen anything there from a CDM point of view that needs to be considered as part of that option?
Yeah, so that depends, as another brilliant consultancy phrase, but it depends heavily on.
I thought you weren't allowed to say that. I thought you're not allowed to say it depends.
shouldn't say it, but there is depending on the content delivery network, the CDN package involved. So if you've got a CloudFront or a Cloudflare license, that will be based on volumes, and these effective hits or requests will impact those volumes, and it just depends on what the appropriate package is. That one actually might be a valid it depends, because I have no way of saying that blanket for everyone. So it might be free because you might not hit the next tier of volumes for the different services, or there might be an extra cost, but it will be fairly minimal because content delivery systems aren't necessarily too expensive.
And I think just as a side point for the Cloudflare with Google Tag Gateway, I believe there is a cost associated. You need maybe an enterprise license or something for GTG routing in Europe. I believe I will check that one as I ask another question, but I think that is something that you need to be aware of.
Yeah.
Sorry, go on, Dan.
I was just going to say, on the server side costings, that is a separate costing in which you're creating a license for hosting your own new server, which obviously comes with a monthly fee or annual fee. And that also is volume based. So it depends a lot on session volumes, event volumes, and all of the different requests that are being sent via the server. Ultimately, it's your usage levels. And this is where you can get creative with both of these things. Actually, you can get creative with which events you're sending and which ones you prioritize. So you don't have to do all or nothing. You can do a tiered system. We've been working with a client recently where, and this is surprising to no one, they've chosen not to send their scroll events because they get so much traffic. Their scroll events on their website would actually just consume all of their possible budget. And they said, actually, we're going to work backwards here. We're going to say, right, send all of the conversions, then our second tier of conversions, then our third tier of conversions, and ultimately build up a better and bigger picture of their data before they start isolating onto scrolls, which are, I mean, not the worst metric, but they're difficult to associate with individuals and difficult to associate with revenue. So I think that's where the business case thing comes in.
And if you were one of the attendees now and you're thinking, okay, this is a path that we would like to explore, what would you recommend being considered as an approach for to build a business plan or business case to go and do this?
So I think a lot of marketing teams have got relatively clear business cases in terms of what costs have gone in, what attributed revenue has come out, what sessions are available for different platforms. And then I think the various different funnel lenses, if we can call it that, or the user journey lenses, are quite well defined in a lot of big enterprises. That's today's version. If you were to then map that out, and you can do that by different channels, if you were to map that out in a new server-side world, that is a good comparison and an uplift and a business case that you could take to finance or even directors or whichever level you need to in order to get budget approval. You can end up in a situation where you can map quite quickly what the outcome might look like. And that's why we always suggest that comparison between the current and the potential future. And this is where you can do various different quick testings of server-side setups, and like I said before, what my uplift might look like. That gives you an indication of what results you could expect across the ecosystem.
Cool. Thank you. So just as one point, just to flag on my mention about Cloudflare's automatic integration. So that, yeah, as Dan said, the setup is quick. It is free to use. However, there's one caveat that we have to flag that for European businesses, the automatic Cloudflare integration doesn't route within Europe right now. So if you are a European-based business, it's worth knowing that. So manual European routing requires a Cloudflare enterprise plan, which comes with a monthly cost, which we don't have any visibility on, but it's just worth noting if you decide to go down that route. So that's all my questions and for Dan. So as we have a few minutes left, if anybody else has any questions, feel free to pop those in the chat just whilst you're doing that. So what we thought we'd do is just wrap up some of the points just to think about, and I think Dan's touched upon these with what we were mentioning a moment ago in terms of what options you should consider based on what we've shared with you today. So these are the kind of questions we think you should ask yourself, which is like, so it depends on what industry you're in. Do you work with multiple advertising partners? So if you are working with a wide range of even advertising partners, but also analytics tools or media CRM platforms, etc., then it's worth questioning which will be the right approach for you. If you're only on client side today, then the options are there for you to decide, do you go to one of the gateways, or do you take the gateway approach, or do you work with a server-side option? And then also determining what your level of advertising and tech spend is. So if you're heavily invested in multiple partners, multiple advertising platforms, then I think you'll probably guess what we would both say in response to that from the options that we've shared today. But having that element of control is obviously very critical for a lot of organizations. So thank you everybody for joining today and listening. If you have any questions, feel free to ask those in the chat or the questions tab. And yeah, thanks very much. And thank you to Dan. I appreciate you spending the time this afternoon, especially when you said, just as we were joining, you have the sun blazing into the blinds behind you. So I can imagine there is a high temperature of degree in that room right now.
No, it's been good to chat. Thank you.